Welcome back to Noclip, the podcast about the people who play and make video games. Danny here, joined by Jesse. What's up, Jesse?
Hey, what's going on?
Well, I'll be honest. I have been doing a lot of talking today. Today was the day we started recording our first ever director commentary album, I guess. We're dropping a fat EP over here on Noclip. So myself and Jeremy have been chatting over Discord for hours this morning. So
oh boy,
apologies in advance if I'm a little bit if the voice is rusty or I just don't have the pep. I did some jumping jacks before we started this one.
There you go.
To try and pep
get the energy
up.
Back in you, eh?
Exactly, yeah. Just do anything. Because in a weird way, this episode is kind of a pretty good use case for why we were bringing the podcast back, because every once in a while we're kind of just left with a good interview and nowhere to put it.
Right.
And you've had the experience of listening to this and editing it. And on this episode, we're going to be jumping into an interview with Dillon Rogers, who's one of the two people working on a game called Gloomwood. The other person, David Szymanski, is most notable for making Dusk. Did you ever play much Dusk?
Yes, I actually beat the whole thing. It is
you did?
So good. I love New Blood Interactive's games. I think they're making some of the coolest stuff right now. So this is awesome that we get to get this interview here on the podcast from one of their newer games coming out soon.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the weirdest things that has happened over the past couple of years is sometimes people keep asking us to do docs on publishers, which to me, I would have thought would have been inconceivable years ago, because publisher is a dirty word, right?
Right, yeah. Nobody likes publishers.
Exactly. Everyone hates EA, everyone hates Activision, everyone hates Bethesda, everyone hates, whoever, right? That's just all you ever hear is people hating on publishers. And the two publishers that people keep bringing up, or actually it's probably a bunch more, but New Blood is one of them. We're constantly people are asking us to do docs on New Blood. Dusk is probably their big breakout one. I think you've been playing Ultra Kill recently, right? Because that's another one. Medieval Gloomwood is probably one of their biggest ones on their forte. What they're sort of talking about at the moment. But Annapurna, we often get Devolver is
Devolver. I was going to say that's got to be the one.
So it's really funny to me because publishers, I can accept that there are publishers working on interesting things and that there are publishers that maybe don't work on interesting things, but also publishers are this sort of money making business side of this thing. So I'm always surprised when people, because they're so skeptical viewers of our stuff of manipulation, then they want us to go do a documentary on a publisher. It's okay.
Well, with publishers of indie games, I mean, especially the ones that you listed there, they're very stylistic. They have a very specific kind of thing that they put out. All of their games are relatively similar in terms of just how good they look and how good they are, right? New Blood especially is that kind of lo-fi aesthetic game that sort of calls back to the older style of PC gaming. So I imagine there's interest in that regard. Devolver, obviously, everything's gorgeous that comes from Devolver. They have a great style just on their own too. I'd love to just hear you talk to Fork Parker for an hour. That'd be great.
Yeah, it's. I guess it's just I love seeing the passion from people, and I accept that it could be a really interesting story and there's interesting things to learn there. But in many of these cases, these publishers are going out and finding games. They're not making these games. Sometimes They're setting up the teams. And New Blood, I don't know, maybe they kind of seem like they maybe are in the weeds a little bit more and that sort of stuff. But folks like Devolver, and we just did the documentary on Death's Door. That's a good example of them going out and finding a game and really pushing it and giving them the resources they needed to do it. But you know what I think it is? I think it's the idea that the publishers themselves have an aesthetic that they're marketing.
Exactly.
It's so wild to me that people are so skeptical in gaming of all of that. Somehow, some publishers like New Blood and Annapurna and Devolver have somehow managed to flip that on its head, where people are fans of the publisher. It's just it's the doc I'd do is a masterclass on marketing, because that's what
Yeah.
they've done, is they've figured out a way of making their brand cool. And it's in like one of the weirdest, like most resistant to cool aspects of the business.
I mean, nothing's as interesting as the E3 shows that Devolver does. Nothing's as cool as that.
I mean, you make a good point. It's not like unearned, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
They put the work in, but like also that's all just advertising, you know. It's like even the cool, you know, interactive video game they put out that year. Was that last year when E3 didn't happen?
Maybe it might have been a year before that, but yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, they put out like a interactive, you know, Devolver Expo that you could walk around and see,
with a bunch
like,
of demos in it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Weird West had a stage or something. You know what I mean? Like, and but yeah, also that is just advertising, you know? So like, I don't know. Maybe it's like my old games journalist brain just melting at new stuff, but I'm really interested in the conflict that exists there. If I did a doc on any of these, that's what I do a doc on. Because otherwise, what would the doc be about? Oh, you guys sell really good games. Like,
What Twitter accounts do you follow to find all these great games you keep picking up? Like, can we talk a little more about that?
You're so online. You really dominate social media, you know? A bit of that comes up in one of our docs, which we announced to patrons, and I can't say here publicly, but we have one doc that we're working on at the moment that has a very like prominent Twitter account that we sort of, it's the first time I think Twitter has come into the conversation in one of our docs before, so it's happening. Speaking of our patronage, if you would like to support this 100% ad-free podcast, well, except for this part right here, fund our documentaries and get access to a bunch of bonuses, including videos, bonus podcast episodes, Discord access, all that good stuff, head over to patreon.com/noclip. Also, those director commentary videos, or rather, they're not videos, they're audios, they're MP3s. We're going to be selling that as an album, I think on Bandcamp. I'm not quite sure exactly where it's going to go. It might go on our own store, but we're going to be doing that mid this month. However, if you were in the $10 tier on Noclip from October 1st up until November 11th, you'll get it for free. We're basically going to send you a Google link on Patreon for you to go and pick that up yourself. We're making the director commentary because people have been asking us to do it for a long time, to look at some of our older docs and tell the stories behind them. So myself and Jeremy did the first part of the Rocket League docs, the first of the Doom docs, the entire Bethesda one, which is like 90 minutes, the Hillbillies of Grand Theft Auto Online one, and the first of our series on CD Projekt, the one that's sort of about Polish history and the founding of CD Projekt. So that will be in the first volume. We're going to sell it for $10. So if you were in the $10 tier, you don't get it for free because you're giving us money, but you're getting $10 value for your $10 patronage.
And a bunch of other cool stuff, right?
Exactly, and a bunch of other cool stuff. And if you go annual, we're trying to get people to go annual. If you can go annual in this ad-free podcast, me selling for 2 minutes after criticizing publishers for being advertisers. Yeah, I know. If you go annual, all that cash is going into a special fund for the 2022 RV project, which we talked about on the Patreon show this month again. We're about 20% funded on that already. So
that's awesome.
That's pretty cool because this month was our annual month where we turned on annual last year. So about half those people kept up at annual and they kicked back in again. So that's all going into a separate fund. So thank you so much to all of our patrons.
Yeah, thanks.
We really, really appreciate it. There's a couple of games I want to talk about before we get into the interview with Dillon about Gloomwood, but also about Thief, because that's the whole problem with this one was I did a documentary on Thief for part of our Greatest Hits show, and we interviewed Dillon because he's working on a game that's very Thief inspired. It's not a Thief game necessarily. It kind of definitely cribs off of certain environmental and gameplay aspects of that game, but it's doing its own thing for sure. So we interviewed Dillon about kind of half Thief, half Gloomwood. So Jesse's doing a great job editing that together so it makes some degree of sense. But before we get into that, a couple of games that we've been playing. Jesse, you wanted to talk about a couple of games you've been enjoying the past week.
Yeah, last week you actually mentioned Guardians of the Galaxy briefly at the end of the podcast, and I'd heard so many good things on Twitter, some great reviews, a lot more positive than I was expecting given the reaction to Marvel's Avengers. And I checked it out, and I was shocked at how actually good that game is. I mean, I'm not too shocked because it's Eidos Montreal. You know, I don't think they've made anything bad, but I really, really like that Guardians of the Galaxy game. Like, the character interactions are really well written. Like, it feels like, I tweeted about it, it feels like It's a bunch of work friends that hate each other but love each other at the same time and are always ribbing each other. It's very funny.
I have to qualify this first. Are you a fan of Guardians of the Galaxy? Because I feel like this game is impossible to recommend to people because the tone of this is either going to piss you off or you're going to get it. And for some reason, I'm not a fan of Guardians, but I do like the writing in this one. But like, it's not for everyone. Are you a fan of the movies or the comics or anything?
Well, definitely the movies. I think like the comics are very different in terms of the tone, except for maybe Rocket and obviously Groot. He hasn't really changed what he says. But the game, yeah, the story is very, and the writing is very evocative of the films. If you don't like that kind of quippy, yelling at each other, everyone's got a good one-liner every 30 seconds kind of thing. If you don't dig that, you're probably not going to end up liking any of the writing in the Guardians of the Galaxy game. But I think it's still really well done, and obviously you don't have to be a fan. Like you said, you're not huge into Guardians of the Galaxy, but you still ended up liking the writing. I think it's just funny. I think it's also really wholesome too. Like something I noticed between the film and the game is that Star-Lord is actually like a person I enjoy hearing from and that I like, because in the movies he sucks. I hate that guy. Like he he is the least interesting character in the entire franchise, I guess, of those films. Whereas in the game, I felt he was really endearing and really like I felt emotionally invested in who he was and the characters around him and his relationships with them.
Yeah, they set him up as a very sympathetic character, like right from the off. You can tell that's what they're trying to do, with like all the, I don't want to talk about the details on it, but like I think the reason I like it, and I don't want this to be a knock against the game or anything necessarily, but I think I did go into this game with fairly low expectations, and it's definitely like beating them. I don't think this is in the conversation for like a game of the year or anything. I think the reason I like it is the pacing's good. It doesn't overstay its welcome on the combat. It doesn't overstay its welcome on the dialogue stuff, on the puzzling bits and bobs that it does. Like, it's kind of always mixing it up, and it seems like it's really trying to keep you entertained and engaged in a way that I find a lot of games, I don't know, I found a lot of like third-person action games have turned into like you're doing a lot of farming in them, you know what I mean? Or it's an open world game and you're sort of having to find your own fun. This is, for me, more of the 360 video game ilk of, Gears of War. You will do this, the things in this order, and we will make sure that they are fun,
That's a really good comparison, yeah, to Gears of War. And especially with what you were saying in terms of it being very straightforward, the exploration too. Like there's points that you can go off and kind of look for stuff, but it's never too long. It's maybe, 30 seconds to a minute. You've done what you've needed to do. You found the cool item, and then you go back to your group and you're doing what you're doing to get the story going forward. So if you're the kind of person who likes linear games, who wants to spend maybe just a week getting through something, I think it's a pretty solid game. The combat's all right, and you have a good time playing it. Yeah, like you're saying, you never spend more than 10 minutes where you're not doing something that's visually cool or like cool to do.
Yeah, I'm just a big baby. Like I just need, there's some games where I need to be like handhold, the whole way through it. I'm playing Inscryption at the moment, which I don't even want to talk about it. It's like it's like Outer Wilds, where you just point people in the direction of Inscryption. It's spelled like crypt in the middle, like INSCRYPTION, I think.
Right.
It's made from the guy who made Pony Island. It is a real like.
Oh, okay.
It's doing some shit. Just don't look up any streams of it or anything, because it might get it spoiled. But it's on the face of it, it's a card game, but I'm not great at card games. It kind of reminds me of something like a Lucas Pope game, like Papers, Please, or Obra Dinn, where if you told somebody that like, oh, I'm playing a detective game on a pirate ship, it doesn't sound exactly very fun. Or like, I'm playing a game where you're a border guard, like it's if I tell you what this game is, that it's like a card game, it just completely undersells it. So all I will say is Inscryption is good fun. And then we got some codes for Darkest Dungeon 2, which came out on early access on Epic Game Store. I haven't had a chance to jump in yet, but you have, right?
I have, yeah. I gave it a couple hours over the weekend and a little bit more in the last couple days, and I'm cut on it. It's weird because I really thought the first one was interesting. I didn't hugely enjoy it, but I did think it was a really interesting game.
It's a tough game to use the word enjoy on, right? 'Cause
Yeah,
it's
exactly. I
just
didn't
so
like
brutal.
playing it. Yeah. It never made me feel good. But it was an interesting game that I think is like super important for the indie space. Where this one, I feel like the parts of the first game that were good are missing, unfortunately.
Hmm.
To go in a different direction, which is an interesting direction. I think it's novel and it's something that they needed to do to switch it up. I don't know if I would want to play Darkest Dungeon again with no changes, but the changes they made almost go a little too far away.
What type of stuff is it?
Well, so the move to 3D was a good idea. Graphically, it looks fantastic, and they still hold the aesthetic, and they've expanded it.
It was kind of 2.5D before, right? It kind of gave that.
Yeah, exactly. And they do the same thing here where elements aren't getting, you don't see characters standing around and stuff, but when they do little animations, it just feels more fluid, which is nice.
Right.
It doesn't get in the way of that aesthetic. From a gameplay perspective, though, there's a lot of like planning that has gone away. There's a lot of interactions outside of battles and stuff because that's gone. It's a full run now where you just go from start to finish, and that's kind of it. Where with the first game, you would stop, you could say, I don't want to do this anymore. This is clearly a bad idea. I'm going to stop this combat and I'm going to go back to the town and we're going to go, this guy needs to go here and, work on, drink a little bit, or he needs to work on not being an
Or
alcoholic.
going insane.
Yeah, yeah. Like you need to work on those stats and send them to the priory or whatever, right? Where with this one, there's less of that, but there's more stuff to care about. Like character relationships is a big part of this game now, where two characters in your party of 4 that you have to pre-select, maybe they won't like each other just based on things that have happened throughout the game. And that will impact their combat stuff. So there's a lot of, like, on top of the original bars you had to watch in the first game, this one now has that and a couple other things, a couple other ailments that your characters can go under. But it doesn't, because there's no time to, like, care about that stuff past the couple of times you get to stop and, like, sit down. You don't get to send them places. I felt less of a connection to the characters. And I felt less like, sad about them going, or just losing out, or just when they got hurt too much or something bad happened to them. I felt less of a connection because there was less of that downtime that you could force and that you had to kind of do. In the first game, I felt bad when characters would have to go away. Like I couldn't bring them on an adventure, but with this one, there is none of that. So there's less of that connection to the characters. It's still good. It's just, I felt less of a connection to the characters, unfortunately.
So big asterisk on this is that this game is not finished. It's in early access. So,
Exactly, yeah.
So what elements of that do you think what are they developing on, right? Because for a game like this, where it's like Darkest Dungeon's fairly modular. Like for people who don't know what this game is, it's a game where you're basically doing these runs into these dungeons, but there's a lot of like, it's almost like Noita, but for like personality traits, where there's a lot of like management of your team, and you have to go back to the village. And I read that the village is in this game again, or the inn is at least.
Yeah.
But have you read like the notes or anything? Do you know what they're adding to it, or what's missing from this version? Because it also looks like it looks pretty good for an early access game. It's kind of like a Hades early access, where it's like, it's not gray box. It looks like it's pretty far along.
Yeah, the art's definitely down. You can feel like that part of it's done. Yeah, I skimmed through the kind of thing that they had briefly, and it looked like they had about a year out. And you can tell right from the start, there's only one campaign that's finished in quotation marks. And there's about 4 more that they're planning on adding. I would assume more elements as well, things you can do in different kind of combat scenarios, a lot more characters as well. There's only 9 at the moment, I believe. So I'm imagining they're going to add a lot more of those as time goes along, more bosses, stuff like that. They incorporate some of the older elements from the first game back, but if they don't, I mean, this is an interesting direction that I'd like to see them expand on more, and it's something I could see myself growing to like as time goes on in the early access production.
That's the thing about early access. You can never tell. I always skip those notes too. You're just like, I just want to get to the game. Let me check it out. But you never know. Like a game like Hades, for instance, like a lot of the balancing stuff, a lot of systems that ended up plugging into how the game work, got added. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But Darkest Dungeon, it's available right now in early access, which sounds like an idiosyncratic thing to say. It's about $30 on, I think it's an Epic Games Store exclusive for early access, which also Hades was. So at least for a time. But yeah, you can check it out over there. All right. Video games. There's a lot of video games. I feel like I'm catching up on a lot of stuff for Game of the Year chitter chatter.
Yeah, me too.
Playing through a bunch. I got some other got some other interesting podcast episodes, some spoiler casts lined up as well for the next couple of weeks and months. So keep your ears peeled for those. But before we get to any of that and we got some questions after this. Let's dive into this interview all about Gloomwood with Dillon Rogers. Jesse, take it away.
So Gloomwood is kind of it's a throwback to immersive sims, mostly Thief: The Dark Project, but it's got a lot of DNA from System Shock 2 in there, from Arx Fatalis, and a couple other survival horror games that I enjoy, like Resident Evil, and even a little bit of Bloodborne in there too. It's a bit of a cauldron of a bunch of different influences. Most of my influences are usually, they grab me because the world is just so tangible and it's such a joy to explore and like see the different characters in the world and in the different spaces, and they feel like their own places. They feel like you could go there and learn the streets and oh, I know where that building is. It's just such a joy to explore this kind of world. So when I started to learn how to make games, I was like, I want to make places that feel tangible and feel like a world that players are going to.
I mean, lots of games can feel tangible, but there's a commonality with the games you mentioned too, which is that they're all kind of weird, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also quite a bit fascinated with I don't know if it's like morbid, but there's a kind of like every one of those universes, everyone's kind of in a bad situation, and they all kind of are aware of it, but they're also kind of okay with it. they've kind of learned to live in like, oh, we live in the city and everything's kind of terrible, but we're still kind of like bumbling citizens or guards or just dealing with the hand that's being dealt with them. And I always felt that was kind of that was neat, that everyone's kind of the world has kind of fallen apart, but everyone's just sort of surviving anyways. Yeah, so I knew with Gloomwood, I wanted to throw back to Thief a lot. But one thing I really wanted to divide myself was I wanted it to feel like Thief, but I didn't want it to just be Thief again. I didn't want to just make like, we're just remaking Thief because, I love Thief. I have this whole world and universe ahead of me, and it's like super weird, and I have to learn all of its rules. I wanted to capture that feeling again and make it feel familiar, but also allow myself room to throw surprises at the player as well. You aren't like Garrett in Gloomwood. You're a Victorian doctor, and you're also have been put into this kind of bad situation of being in a city you've never been to before, where something clearly is going on that is way, way beyond anything that you know about. There is stealth, and there are like definitely elements of like, oh, you're sort of like Garrett hiding in the dark, but it's a bit more clumsy on the player's part. There are times where it's like, oh, I'm caught. I have to pull out a revolver and clumsily shoot it at someone who is, coming at me with like an axe. There are definitely similarities and like elements like Thief, but we've also, we've kind of tried to take Thief and the other inspirations and make something that feels like it would have come out around that time and being like a sibling game to them.
I guess to that point then, there is a world in which Thief is a bit more of a straight-laced kind of fantasy, or at least the world it is more of a sort of a straight-laced fantasy game. Do you think the almost kind of subtle dark elements of that game, the sort of like Cthulhu-esque monsters and the steampunk or like futurist magic technology, do you think without that game would have been less interesting to you?
It would definitely be less interesting to me without those elements. I've always kind of thought Thief shares a legacy with horror, but it's, as you noted, it's very subtle horror. It's very kind of like undertone. We're guards, we live in the city, and there's like lobster monsters that live under the sewer grates, and we're fine with it. It's just kind of the place that we live, and you don't see that kind of stuff spoken with that understanding of the place that they're in. The game is constantly throwing new twists at you. You start off with Lord Bafford's manor, and it's like, okay, I got this game. I figured it out. We're gonna be robbing mansions and stuff, and all of a sudden, the next level, you're thrown into mines and tombs, and it's just like, this is an adventure now. I honestly don't know if I've played a game that captured my imagination as much as the Sword has, the Constantine's Manor.
Open for me. Open to me. Open.
I love that level so much, and it's just the contrast of, like, you're starting this mission and it just looks like it's a manor. It's like, okay, I've done this before. I know what I'm doing. You, at that point when that level comes in the game, you've kind of figured Thief out. You've survived a bunch of missions, some really quirky hard missions like the Bone Horde. You know how the game works. The first sign you can tell something's up is the window you climb up next to is like twisted. It's so funny. Like, it's like, oh, that's weird. Like, why is that window like 45 degrees? Like, who would do that? You keep going into that manor and just things get worse and worse, and you're just like, now you're walking into like, oh, it's a hallway that's just turning around on itself. Oh, he has a jungle inside his home. There's like a moment where you're walking down a hallway and the hallway starts getting smaller, and then the door you get to, it's like too small to go through. It's like, it's so good. It just harkens back to this like mentality with level design that, like, oh, we could just really mess with the player, that we could really throw them for a loop. It's so playful in a way that I find so inspiring and fascinating.
It's a twist on the power fantasy as well, I feel. You mentioned that, and also like the second level when you go into the prison. They're both levels where you've sort of gotten used to the idea of like, oh, I'm the one that's entering their worlds. But then suddenly you're in these worlds where the further you go into them, you're like, do I want to be here? Like, this is like, I feel like I'm stuck, or it feels like oppressive and scary.
It's great too, because Garrett is super powerful. Like, he is essentially invisible in the dark, and it's amazing that they turn that and they make you feel scared at times with it. It really does feel like sometimes I'm the hunter and sometimes I'm the prey.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the vibe I got from it, was that feeling of when you first played Thief, especially given when it came out. I was trying to remember what it was like booting up a first-person game where I instantly was expected to not do the one thing that every FPS told me to do, which was to shoot everyone, and then having to learn what that means. Of course, you go back and play Thief now, it's actually pretty par for the course, because stealth games have basically run with that template, right? You can sort of backwards understand it. Whereas when I was playing Gloomwood, it felt a bit more like, oh, I'm not quite sure where the rules are in a first-person game. That act is refreshing. Do you think that like creating first-person games in 2021 is just much harder than it would have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago because you're fighting against this player expectation? Like, is that part of the design process?
It's kind of yes and no, but in kind of different ways. In terms of like the technical side of making like an FPS now, it's way easier. Looking at how big our team size at like New Blood is, like for the most part, it's like me and David Szymanski, the guy who made Dusk, who are mostly working on Gloomwood right now, and then like we have a bunch of people at New Blood who help with like QA and such like that. That part is much easier. We don't have to have like a whole studio like Looking Glass to make like one game. In terms of design, yeah, that part is definitely, you're definitely fighting conventions and like expectations. On top of that, like the expectations of Thief fans entering something like Gloomwood and being like, hey, I'm going to play this exactly like Thief, right, and then kind of getting confused when, we put a gun in their hand. Or on the other hand, some people will enter Gloomwood and maybe haven't played Thief at all, and will use the gun right off and will immediately run out of ammunition and kind of be like, I do not know what I'm doing and I'm totally out of options. So it is a kind of like a balancing act, and we're trying to sort of get people into understanding this kind of weird hybrid of like Thief and a bunch of other games that we've sort of put together. But it's also a fun challenge because it's like once it clicks, it's very fun to watch them kind of figure it out.
Why do you think it is that people? I know you're not making. We've established that you're not, like, Gloomwood is not a Thief-like. I don't know what we call it. It's not a pure sort of, I don't know, like stealth fantasy thing or whatever. Mm-hmm. Why do you think the stealth sort of elements of stealth from Thief they're an ingredient in lots of games, but pure stealth game hasn't seemed to have been made.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think that I don't want to say it's like a consoleization, because it's the stealth genre has a large history behind it, but there were sort of like conventions that came about over time that sort of stuck. Like one really popular one was like giving the player the ability, like supernatural abilities, where they could like see through walls or know where enemies are directly around them. And I think that that was a really interesting way to go, and you can see that to like great effect in something like Dishonored, where like it makes sense. He's got, you know, void powers, and it makes sense that Corvo is this kind of like magical assassin. Now that I feel like we're sort of coming back a little bit. Immersive sims are kind of seeing a small resurgence in like the indie scene a little bit. We're getting kind of a couple more of those games, and we're sort of looking back and seeing, you know, what kind of made those games work really well. With something like Thief and its approach to stealth, Thief is really about like partial or incomplete information. That's kind of what makes it really like tense for me. You can't see through walls. All you can really do is sit in the shadows and watch, and more specifically listen. Because really, Thief's big technological advancement beyond just like the graphics in 1998 and all the like fancy tech is sound. The sound propagation is wild in that game. The way it like filters through doors and manipulates based upon what room it's in is really like super advanced for the time it came out.
Can you talk a bit about how tricky that process is? Because I know in Gloomwood as well, there is a lot of listening. You have, you know, listening through doors, and, you know, the whole resting your ear and trying to figure out where people are, leaning, which is a convention that came into a lot of those games, which now seems to have a different reason it exists. It doesn't seem to be about stealth so much. How tricky is it to, again, I guess you're almost teaching people that shit, because they, you know, we don't think about footsteps in games at all, really. My two questions, I guess, are how tricky is it from a technical perspective to do that type of thing, and also how tricky is it to teach the player that this is something they need to concern themselves with?
Yeah, it was tricky from both a technical and a design perspective. When I originally kind of started putting together a lot of these stealth systems, I originally was just sort of like, okay, well, like, we'll make every sound important, and the player will just have to parse it all, and that was a mistake. The really big thing about making a stealth game is you have to be super cautious about what information you're giving to the player, because it needs to matter. The footsteps are like a huge deal. The like mutterings that guards do, the whistling, the humming, huge deal, because they all give the player information about the location of where threats are, what direction they're coming in, and what kind of threat they are.
All right, I hear you. Come out in the open at once.
There was definitely a point in time with Gloomwood where we kind of had to step back and be like, okay, what sound effects are super vital for the player to understand what's going on in the game world, and what sound effects kind of need to take a back seat and are just sort of like ambient and fill in the atmosphere around that. And technically, the way that Thief does a lot of the sound propagation stuff is very handcrafted and authored. There's not a lot of ways you can really achieve that kind of system. You know, I couldn't run a script and like turn all my buildings into these perfect boxes of like how the sound moves between them, because there's a lot of intent around how they set up those, like how sound moves. It's very much like, this is going to be a tile room, and this is going to be a difficult room for the player to cross. They're going to have to figure out where to put moss arrows, or where the carpet's going to be. It's not just, you know, we make the tech and let it run off and it does its own thing. It's every layer is very designed.
Right.
And it works too, because it comes together as this really cohesive whole.
Right. I guess it's a byproduct of having a small team. It's a byproduct of modern game engines, that sort of like turnkey solution they have for every single thing that they had to build basically from scratch doesn't come by default in a game you're making in 2021.
Yeah, and there was the same thing on our end. Like, I originally started trying to make like a script that did it all automatically, and I was like, I'm not really happy with this. It doesn't really feel like Thief to me. So what I actually did was I went back and watched and read a lot of the papers that the team used to make their sound propagation systems, and was like, okay, you know, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it like authentically. We're going to do it right.
One difference between the two games in terms of the way in which sound is used. For instance, is like Thief's guards and their mutterings are, it's kind of like, it's sweet.
Something there.
Because it's just so silly that they're basically like commentating. We talked to them. Apparently the commentary system is literally pulled from the golf game that they made.
He's put that one in the fairway about 235 yards out.
But they're basically like doing play-by-plays of what they're up to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gloomwood obviously employs a sort of more visual sense in that respect with the eyes of the guards giving you different states. Tell us about the decision to do that. Was it ever even an option, I guess, that you would have them talk fucking... I didn't notice you.
Yes, and actually, you'll probably see, but there are some that do talk. We did decide to go that direction for some of the enemies, not all of them. The crowmen that live under the city are still, they still have those kind of like gaspy whispering that they do. They're basically similar to like the craymen and the hammerhawns and such. But the tone is definitely different. For Gloomwood, we're kind of doing that dance between like, is it Thief or is it System Shock? And System Shock is way more kind of like it's trying to scare you.
Right. Yeah.
Part of the challenge of that is trying to gauge when the game needs to be a bit more lighthearted and when we need to push the gas on the horror. And so like the guards are kind of like the middle ground of that. They're not super scary. They're still kind of silly, but
All seems quiet now.
all those visual tells and all those animations are there to sort of help the player still understand what they're sort of doing and how to react to them and not I don't know why I got caught. He seemed like he wasn't like looking in my direction, which is when you make a stealth game, it is so. You're basically making an AI that feels fun to trick, but they still have to be very easy to trick in a lot of ways. Because if you make them too difficult, it's not very fun. You just feel like you just keep getting frustrated over getting caught. And I do think Thief did a really good balance of that, making guards that feel very fun to trick, but it's not impossible to trick them. So we're trying to sort of follow that a little bit with like Gloomwood. We also have to understand that like some of the people who've come into this game may not have played Thief at all. So stuff like the cones changing color is like really helpful for newer players. It's a traffic light. It's like it's green. Green means go. Yellow means slow down. Red means you're caught. As you play the game, the next enemies don't have those cones and are way freakier. And there's a great moment in the demo that I really love watching players hit, which is they go below the city and the tone immediately changes. Now they're in the sewer and there's like weird creatures and they're like, I thought I was playing like a much easier, much less terrifying game. And it's absolutely a joy to watch that moment happen.
So obviously you're a scholar of the genre, of the games. You mentioned as well that you've clearly even gone back and looked at source material that the original team has worked on. Have you had much contact with people at Looking Glass?
A couple different people, yes. Before the pandemic happened, we were at PAX. This was like the first time we were really showing off Gloomwood to people to play it. And I was watching people play the game because I was trying to get like feedback for like, what are we doing right? And this guy came in and started playing it. And I usually, when people are playing it, I'm sort of like, what's your experience with Thief? Like, are you a new player to it? Have you played it before? What are you sort of like expecting? And the guy was like, oh yeah, no, I was the QA lead for Thief 2. I was like, wait, what? It's just great. Like, oh, you run into Looking Glass people like everywhere once you start like digging into the immersive sim genre, and like all those people, they may be at different studios, but they're still kind of carrying the torch in their own sort of way. They still follow a lot of the same, like, this is the stuff that I love, and I'm still like, this is a big part of why I'm in this industry. And anytime I meet or talk to people who've worked on Thief, that passion shines through, and you can tell they bring it to like anywhere they work.
We're asked all the time to look into studios like Looking Glass, and we're asked a lot to look about immersive sim games. And then, you talk to some of the people who are the money folks, and they'll say like these games have these diehard followings and these people who will, play every immersive sim that comes out. And like, I mean, Dishonored 1 and 2 are fantastic. Prey is amazing. Mooncrash is great. But they seem to never sell the money required to make maybe the AAA versions of them, or just, maybe they never did. I mean, look at Glass Closed, right? It's an unfair question to ask you, considering you're on the other end of it. But when you make a game like this, are you trying to make it for everyone? Is there a version of the immersive sim that does have mass appeal, or is the beauty of these games that they don't? That this is kind of a bit of a niche type of game that really matters to some people and maybe doesn't have that mass appeal?
I don't know. When I started working on this game, I mostly started making it for me, because obviously this is the kind of stuff that I really love, and I wanted to see more of it in the industry. I initially thought like, okay, well, I'm going to work on this, and because it's an immersive sim, it's going to have a small following, and it's going to be kind of like, I'm okay if it's not a huge hit, because it's what I wanted to do. Then over time, I discovered that way more people are like super into this genre as well. And you're right, it does have a diehard following. I don't think the immersive sims genre will ever have like the mass appeal of like, it's never going to be a battle royale. It's probably never going to be like that again, like how it was when like Deus Ex 1 came out. There is such a sort of magic to this genre that is so fun to see when new people like try it out and discover it, because I kind of feel like it's discovering like a From Software game for the first time. It kind of ruins a lot of other games for you. You kind of get into it and it's kind of like, dang, this is what games can be. Like, I want more of this. The trouble is always getting people to check it out, because yeah, it's also very understandable that these games can be kind of overwhelming. Even Dishonored, like probably the most accessible and most successful of the immersive sims, still has so many mechanics to it that you will just like freeze up at times and be like, I don't know how I'm supposed to play this. Am I supposed to be stealth, the magical death wizard? Like, but I still feel like the genre deserves a place in the industry, even if it isn't like the top winner. It's a part of games, and it's a part of the history of what games mean to people and how we tell fiction in games. It's worth pushing it, even if it's not, a publisher's dream.
Thank you so much. Before I close it out, you basically answered everything I wanted to. Is there anything that you sort of would like to mention?
Yeah, I just I'm always thankful for the time I got to spend doing this. I'm thankful for all of the fans that have played the Gloomwood demo. I'm like, I honestly never thought it would get this big. I never thought I'd see streamers playing it, and it's been a complete joy.
All right, there we go. Thank you to Dillon for taking time to talk to us about Gloomwood. I would not be surprised if they announce some sort of release date soon. Like it's still like, I think TBA 2021. So who knows? Like this time of year is always really weird with people, rushing games out or deciding very last minute to hold it until, Q1 2022, which is looking real packed at the moment.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to put anything out there right now. There's way too many games.
It's bizarre. There's so much. But yeah, thanks for putting that together, Jesse. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Bit of a melange of an interview. A spice melange.
Super interesting, though.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that's the end of our Thief content for a little while. Unless you said that Eidos Montreal didn't have a weak step, but that 2014.
Well, actually, yeah, I guess you're right, huh? Forgot about that one until you mentioned it there in the interview.
Yeah, we didn't get a chance to talk to Eidos Montreal about their 2014 version of Thief. Quite frankly, we had too many interviews for the greatest hits to go diving into that, but it'd be fun to talk about some of that stuff, especially considering how good a job and how popular it seemed the Deus Ex series that they brought back, when Mankind Divided and Human Revolution ended up being either side of that. But anyway, we go to some questions before we wrap up this week's show. I think we got some over Twitter and Discord, right, Jesse?
We did, yeah. On Discord, Adam N asks, since so much of your work revolves around building relationships with game developers, Where do you draw the line between the personal and the professional? To put it another way, are you comfortable calling any of the people you've interviewed or anyone else in the games industry your friend?
Friend, man, who's in the friend zone? Who are the developers
Oh, yeah.
that are in my friend zone? I think it's pretty easy for me to draw like the uncomfortable feeling that would emerge from me softballing somebody because I know them would like sicken my stomach so badly that there's no chance I'd even go there. Now, I'm kind of the type of person who the friends that I have a small group of friends who I'm very connected with, people I've like known for a long time back home, or people who are important in my life. And then I have like I'm a pretty open guy. Like I have lots of people who I consider my friends who are outside of that sort of very tight-knit bubble, but I don't feel like I couldn't be real with those people. You know what I mean? So like when it comes to interviewing developers, I don't think I have any developer friends who are like I'm besties with, you know what I mean? And if I was, maybe I wouldn't cover their game, perhaps, if I felt that way about it.
That's fair.
Yeah, but also like the dynamics of this stuff is different because anytime you're going into, they don't even have to be your friend, I think, for that to create a problem for some people. Like I know some people who cover game studios, maybe they're part of a fan community, so they're really sort of invested in the game and invested in that relationship, or you know, maybe it's the first time they've had an opportunity to do it, so there's a lot more of a, you know, one-sided power struggle there or something. We kind of pick and choose the projects we want, and also I don't, if I get that sense that somebody's trying to like mush us around, like sometimes we'll get in contact with a company through their marketing department or through their influencer department, which is now a new thing. And if that happens, they can often have more of a heavy hand, and then we usually don't go there. You know, a PR person's job is to be sort of professional while being friendly. And I think that's a way more comfortable way for me to operate. Like I can be a nice person, but when push comes to shove, I'm there to do a job. And my bosses are the 5,000 or so patrons that we have. It's
Right.
and I'm, you know, I hold myself accountable to them, not to any sort of personal relationship I have. I mean, we respect the people we interview, and you know, projects like the Astroneer doc are a good example of like when stuff gets personal in a way that you need to like, you know, sort of have a delicate hand with it. But I don't feel like no one's going to invite me to a wedding or something if I gave them a shitty interview. You know, that's not how.
No, you don't have Todd Howard on speed dial?
No, like we know loads of those people, and like, you know, I would call it a professional respect or something, you know, a mutual respect. It's not that. So yeah, it's not really an issue for me. I suspect if that's an issue for you, you don't get into this type of work, because it would just be like either people would see right through your bullshit, or it would be so stressful for you to keep putting your friends in that situation that you just stop. So yeah, thankfully not really an issue. Hasn't been, at least, and it's been half a decade now.
All right, over on Twitter, Nick Savak asks, any chances or desire for a Neversoft doc? I think the story from Tony Hawk to Guitar Hero to eventually ending on Call of Duty would be fascinating to hear.
Do you ever play many of those games? You play Tony Hawk games, Guitar Hero games?
Tony Hawk, not so much. Guitar Hero, oh yeah. That is my bread and butter, baby. I play that all the time. I have way too many guitars that my girlfriend gets very upset about me having. Oh yeah, and they all work, which
really?
is shocking.
Dude, you can sell those on eBay for a pretty price right now.
I'm never going to do that. Danny, I love me some Guitar Hero, all right?
You just said you have too many.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm not getting rid of them. Don't let my girlfriend listen to this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard a lot of people ask that we do a Tony Hawk thing, and obviously there's that Tony Hawk doc that got made, Pretending I'm Superman, which got announced around the time we started Noclip, so that's why we didn't. That, and I also had done a video at GameSpot where I interviewed Tony Hawk. It's one of my favorite episodes of my old show, The Point, actually, because I interviewed a guy from my hometown who skateboarded, and we went to EMB in San Francisco, and it was part of an interview I did with Tony Hawk at E3, and it was really cool. I should say it was really cool. I was really proud of it. It was something I was super invested in, and I was really happy with how it turned out. But yeah, I guess I hadn't even thought about the idea of like just charting that weird thing. I guess the part of me that feels like maybe there is a story there, it's so steeped in business that I worry that there's just going to be Activision NDAs all over it, and we'll never actually get to talk about it, and it'll just be a weird puff piece about Neversoft. that's why I tend to not try and tell the stories of studios unless they are independent. And then if they're not, we tell the story of the game, because then we can get into the nitty gritty and we don't have to worry about, you run up against walls when you start to talk about like, because what is Neversoft's story? They were making rad skateboarding games. Then Activision saw how popular Rock Band was and decided to pivot and do Guitar Hero. And then they were making Guitar Hero games. And then they got folded into Call of Duty stuff, like because the bubble burst. Like maybe that's not the story, but to me, that's like kind of a depressing story about business. And if that's the case, maybe doors close because people don't really want to tell the thing.
Yeah. You want to tell the sad story about the progression of your company? There are some interesting stories about the peripheral side of things, but I don't know how you make a documentary about that.
I think Harmonix would be almost an easier one to pull off because they're still around.
Yeah.
And they're still in the physical music business, which they were before anyone was, and they kind of still are. And that's not to like, I loved Guitar Hero as well. I have a bunch of them and I bought them over the years. But, I think if you want the story of that type of thing, and maybe one that's a little bit more emotionally touching, I suspect Harmonix, a studio that was invented to make music games, by a bunch of musicians, is kind of maybe a little bit closer to that. I would love to do the Tony Hawk, design doc. I think Pretending I'm Superman does a really good job of diving into some of that, and also kind of talks about culturally how important that game was to skating and to 90s and early aughts culture. But yeah, I'd love to just talk to whoever made Warehouse and School 2 and dive into that. That'd
awesome.
be cool.
Yeah. All right, our last question here is from the Nth Review. By the way, great YouTube channel.
Yeah.
How do you feel about addressing criticisms about a game when talking face-to-face with a developer? One of the hardest things you can do as a games reviewer is tell some HR staffer their game has faulty or bad features. How do you break that bread with a dev or project lead?
I don't tell people their games are bad.
Yeah. How do you open that? Hey, I wanted some of your time. Your game was awful. Could you tell us why?
Yeah. I can't imagine a scenario in which I would tell, like, unless they asked, unless I was like doing a QA thing. Because like, to me, it's not difficult criticizing games because I was a game critic for years before I did this. Right. I tend to not do that as much because, like, honestly, my brain has been poisoned because after spending a year probably of doing Noclip, I realized that I knew nothing about how games are made. The veil of knowledge that I thought I had, or the veil of ignorance maybe, was lifted, and I was like, oh, like, I know nothing. Like, kind of all game reviewers, like, they understand games as, do I enjoy this? And like, is this a worthwhile product to purchase? But when it comes to like how games play and design decisions, I think it's lucky that we know nothing, because the minute you learn a little bit, you realize how little you know. It's like once you get an eye of how much you don't understand, it's harder. So for me now, it's harder for me to be that specific. Like I'll talk a lot about a game I like or dislike and why I like or dislike it, because I also like think that the brain I used to have was very much like, oh, this is a bad game because of X, and that's why nobody will like it,
Right.
Whereas it's like the Guardians of the Galaxy thing. I totally understand if people think this is the best game they've ever played. I totally understand if it's people who think it's trash, or if it's just some thing that they enjoy playing on a Friday night while they're sort of not, they're half paying attention or listening to a podcast. But I think we're very bad at like surfacing that. Like we tend to talk in absolutes about how good a game is, and we look at Metacritic for the like, this is how the culture has decided this game is good or bad. So when it comes to like there's very rarely a situation where I'm telling somebody a game is good or bad. However, if like we're in a situation where we're talking about a game which clearly had a bad reception, or we're talking about a game that had a bad moment, or had one element in it that they had to fix, or there's something there. Like by the time we're there at the studio, like they know what story we're going to tell, and they'll totally know the type of thing we'll want to talk about. Like we just did earlier today, the director commentary for Doom, right? So we talked a bunch about how, like when we were going to the studio, we were like, well, we want to talk to you about the cancelled Doom game because you've never talked about it before. And we're going to ask the questions, and you can not answer the questions, or you can answer the questions. Like that's kind of how it happens, right? Like our job is to sort of ask, and if they don't want to answer, that's fine. Like then we have them not answering on camera, And the same with the Final Fantasy stuff, where like if we're going to do a story on Final Fantasy, everyone in the room knows that the story is going to involve 1.0 and what happened. So it's never a case where like I'm sitting down and being like, hey, let's talk to us about, let's pretend Gloomwood had already come out and it has a really problematic level, you know?
Right.
And then and then I go, hey, you know what, Dillon? What about that level? I thought it was shit because of this and that. You know what I mean? Sorry, not to be reductive of the Nth Review's good question, but it doesn't happen that way. You know what I mean? There's no gotcha moment when it comes to these docs because they know the questions that are coming. And sometimes there are difficult questions. And are they difficult for me to ask? Like, not really. It's difficult strategically because I always try and find the right place to ask the hard questions. Like once people have relaxed and once they're talking and once they're in the headspace of that time, you know, trying to find the strategic right time to ask them is probably the hardest part, but not the asking. That's why we're there. That's why I got on a plane for 4 hours and said bye to my wife and kid for 5 days. And, you know, we spent all this money was to come and ask the question. So when it comes to the moment, there's no problem asking the question because otherwise I'll just be pissed off at myself, you know?
All right, and that's the questions for this week. Thanks so much to everyone who sent them in. If you want to email us, you can hit up podcast@noclip.video or follow us on Twitter @noclipvideo. Danny, take us out here.
Yeah, we got some, I'm trying to think what's coming out. It's always the start of the month is always a little bit weird because you're kind of like, we tend not to publish stuff near the end of a month because of the way Patreon bills people. It's so weird. There's a bunch of Patreon stuff hitting the Patreon. So there's a patron show this week. I recorded the next Noclip wish list, which is the show where I cover, I talk about games that we've never done docs on that I'd love to do. GTA 5 this month. So I jumped into Los Santos for the first time in a while. So that'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. We'll have Edit Club. We'll have all those bits and bobs. The 2 docs that are coming out this month, though, which you can look forward to later in November, are The Forgotten City. Jake Decker is doing a great job on that. I've watched a rough cut of it. It's super good, and it's about 30 minutes long or so. Really interesting story, especially the guy who made it is like, it's such a fascinating story. Guy'd never made a game before, worked on a mod for a while, but then like people were saying, you should turn this into a game. And it's like first person game with no combat. It's all story driven and how he figured it out and the profession he left to do it. It's a really interesting one. And then the other one is the one I'm editing at the moment, which is the DMA design doc. So it's all about Grand Theft Auto 1, 2 and Lemmings. Basically everything before GTA 3, which is like perfect timing now because that Grand Theft Auto Definitive Edition is coming out.
Boom, cross promotion, shout outs.
Yeah, thanks to our good friends at Rockstar for doing that. Please let us come and interview your people sometime. That was another one we did for the director commentary dude, was the Hillbilly Agenda one. So Rockstar on the brain this month for sure. At Noclip Video on Twitter. I'm at Daniel Dwyer. He's at Got to do it, man.
All right, Garasha. That's Guara, S like Sam, CIA.
Love it. YouTube.com/NoclipVideo for the docs. YouTube.com/NoclipPodcast. If you want to listen to this on your browser or wherever podcasts are sold, please drop those reviews. Please rate us over there. Do all that goodness. Next week's episode will be a patron exclusive, so we'll be dark here on the feed. We might put up a little bit of a preview or like a taster of it or something. But if you want to get in on that, you have to come over to patreon.com/noclip and help fund us. It's in the tier with all the extra shows and stuff. So if you join on that one, you get a shed load of stuff. Jesse, what are you going to play for the rest of your week? Any games lined up?
Well, I'm definitely going to try to finish up Guardians of the Galaxy, but you've got me interested in Inscryption. Really, this podcast is just turning into you recommending me games to play. So this is great.
Well, I want to play Darkest Dungeon now. I want to see what the deal is over there.
There you go.
And what's going on. So yeah, we're just sharing and share alike. Although it is really hard this time of year because I already feel like a billion games just came out in a month.
Next week, every game that matters is going to come out in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Oh, God, I totally forgot. Isn't
Forza Horizon's out in like a week or two. Infinite's out next month. Like, there's a ton of big things coming out from Xbox. PlayStation's, I think, got a couple things coming out.
Yeah, well, weather's getting shitty and the days are getting shorter, so it's a good a time as ever, I guess. Thank you all so much for listening to the podcast. Thanks to Jesse for producing this bad boy. Thanks to all our patrons for funding it. We will see you all. Well, we'll see some of you next week. We'll see the rest of you in 2 weeks' time. Take care.